So welcome, everybody. Welcome back. This is the final session of this wonderful symposium that we've been at today. And this final session is going to be takeaways. So this is a takeaway in that it's just going to be a big open discussion started by and with our guest panelists and our graduate discussants who are all invited here today. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves.
Hi, everybody. I am Shawn. I am an associate professor of French in the Department of Languages and Cultures here at FIT.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Laciste, and I am an assistant professor in the History of Art department at FIT.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Miyuki Babcock, and I am an assistant professor in History of Art and Design at Pratt Institute, but I do still teach a class here in the History of Art on Fridays.
Hi, I'm Emma McClendon. I'm assistant professor of fashion studies at St. John's University in Queens. But before my previous life, I was a curator at the museum at FIT for basically all of the 2010s. So it's nice to be back.
Hey everyone, I'm Gabe Tennen. I'm a Ph.D. candidate and instructor in the Department of History at Stony Brook University and a museum scholar at the Museum of the City of New York.
Hi everyone, my name is Kishan. I am currently at the New School doing my dual MFA in Fashion Design and Society with a major in Anthropology and Design.
Hi, I'm Kate Sekules. I'm doing my PhD at Bard Graduate Center, title History and Theory of Mending, and I also teach fashion history at Pratt and a course called Mending Fashion at Parsons.
And I failed to introduce myself, but my name is Helen Lane, and I am the instructional design librarian at the FIT library here. So, wow, was so much covered today in all of the sessions. We looked at scarves and their production, and they're using those as a way to research a period in history. And we looked at wonderful garments that were made in honor, or garment made in honor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster. We looked at lesson plans that involve multiple modalities of teaching and learning, incorporating film, popular culture, about labor into language study. So this panel that we have here represents a wide range of interests and specialties. And my question to you is, reflecting both on the previous sessions and on your own pedagogical experience, how might you be incorporating these types of practices into what you're doing now? And I'll just open this up to anybody who wants to answer the question. Okay, yeah. Okay, there you go. Okay.
So as I said, I teach fashion studies at St. John's University. St. John's is a massive university. Unlike FIT or Parsons or Pratt, we do not focus on fashion. We're not an art and design school. So fashion it's a small little node in everything that goes on there. We don't teach design. We're instead sort of bridging business and humanities in our fashion studies classes. And I'll just say that today has been incredibly rich and wonderful to hear so much about not only the projects you guys are doing, I love hearing from the students, but to see this dedication to open access is really uplifting personally, sort of, thinking about how I can use this. I mean, I will honestly be returning to the Showgirls database for, every semester, I think, to look at these wonderful variety of different types of both sort of syllabi, sort of larger form, but then smaller focused dialogues and clips. I mean, for me, just off the bat, I can immediately see how to integrate it into merchandising classes, but also and into fashion history classes that I teach. But also thinking more specifically, I teach an entire course on denim, thinking about it from a material and design perspective, but also from a social and historical perspective. And central to that class is grappling with the history of denim as a workwear material. So labor is always there. So sort of coming back to that and thinking about how to integrate some of these more oral history and interview projects and case studies, I think is wonderful. I don't know who else. Who?
So I kind of straddle two worlds. I teach at a university, but I also do a lot of museum education. And so I think that bridging the gap between academic history and using material culture as an instructive tool is a really interesting route to take. And so I think that this is applicable in that sense of going a sort of less didactic route in terms of instruction and using different entryways to get into bigger questions about labor history.
Well, just as a follow-up, a lot of what we looked at today involved, well, there was a lot that we looked at today, but that we saw and we heard about. But some of the projects really focused in on using the making of an object as a gateway towards learning about history. And in some cases, you had people who were already in a field where learning to make the thing was what the course was supposed to be about, and it was the history that was brought in. And in other cases, it was sort of the reverse, where you were making in a context where making isn't normally what you do. Do you have experience with that type of thing in your own teaching, or do you once again see ways that you find that pedagogically rich?
So I should also provide some additional context into my field of specialization within art history. So I'm an Egyptologist. I deal with ancient cultures and ancient materials. So a lot of this is, seemingly initially seems very foreign, right? But obviously as an art historian, we do a lot of object-based learning and looking at materials. And it might be hard to imagine, how do I do a making project with ancient Egyptian stuff? But I have an assignment where I ask students to design their own false door. So anyone who knows about false doors in ancient Egypt, you know what I'm talking about. But it's basically a symbolic portal between our world and the deceased's world. And it's a way for students to think about the design, looking at motifs, like different doors very carefully, deciding which motifs they're going to include from the various doors that they've looked at. It means studying the texts that are written on the doors and understanding how it is arranged. And through this process, my students realize what was important to the ancient Egyptians, how they designed this particular image, and how it conformed to their ideas about the world and ideas about design. But it also allows them to self-reflect too, and it makes it more entertaining, I think. Also makes it very AI-proof, by the way. So it's really useful. And also for my design students, I think they really enjoy it because they're actually producing something that they could put in a portfolio as well. So it becomes, not one of these projects that's disposable, but something that's actually useful.
Or do you want to go first? Oh. I guess I should also provide context to what I do within art history. So my specialty is in African art and visual culture. And sometimes the objects that I teach, I really don't know who the makers are, just because of the ways in which a lot of the objects have been collected and displayed, especially in a museum or gallery context. And so my first semester at FIT, I kept getting the question from my students, but how is it made? And I realized I was so preoccupied with the social, historical, cultural, gender-specific, political context that I completely overlooked the fact of, how was this actually made? And so I think being a part of this project and just from conversations with students has been so enriching for me as an educator, because I realized that, I should try to investigate these things as well. That way I can give a more holistic picture to what I'm teaching.
A little context on my research. I am in French cultural studies, and one of the things that I do is work with LGBTQ plus youth populations in the city of Paris, and a lot of those youth are immigrants. And over time, as I began to work more closely with them, I got into issues and questions of what they do for employment, how do they earn money for survival. And I came across a wonderful project in Paris, the Renaissance Project. And essentially, couture houses in Paris donate unwanted fabric and garments, and we use this to create, we of course refer to this as upcycling, but we use this to create garments, and the garments are created by these immigrants in warehouses, one of which being in a particular suburb of Paris. And as I got more deeply involved in this, I began to realize that these immigrants were, not surprisingly, plagued by questions of, am I here with legal status? And it's quite disturbing in some ways, in that they were reluctant to respond to a lot of my questions, not surprisingly, because they were worried that they would be, among other things, deported. And so I think what I take away from this project is, in terms of cultural studies in France, is that we are still dealing with questions and issues today in 2024, unfortunately, that involve terrible treatment of immigrants in France, in the city of Paris. And I think students can take away from this that historically, and in terms of contemporary culture, these issues and these questions are closely linked to what I teach in terms of the history of France, the culture of France, and also the history of fabric making and clothing production, and one of the countries that and cultures that we associate first and foremost with the industry.
Thank you. Any other reflections? I don't. I just realized that my sort of went in one direction. You looked like you needed to say something.
I taught a history of fashion by like initial class, like a 101 history of fashion last semester, and then this semester I taught 2 fashion studies pathways. And I think the biggest problem that we have with the humanities and the making side is trying to bridge the gap, and to hear that when we're talking about scarf making and we're talking about I come from a background of silk screen printing. My dad's a silk screen printer, so it's something I know since growing up. And it's how do you do kind of that research and relay it into a meaningful message and have people still be interested? And something else that came into mind is, how do we get people to take the business classes? I went to do my BA at Central St. Martin's, and we had like 3 business classes, and only 2 people would ever really turn up. So often the question would be, how do you bridge that gap of creative education and getting people to go to the business classes because they're just as vital, and the humanities classes are just as vital because they add context to the work they do. It's a big issue that we face across the board now that I started teaching. I think oftentimes there's very specific departments who will really have students who take fashion studies classes, and then there'll be specific departments where they just don't.
So you're talking about the siloing?
Yeah, and how like everything becomes separated as an institution. And I think there's a big question on how we start engaging people a bit more in it, and how it shouldn't be so separated. Research should be part of the design process, and the design process should be part of the research, and it should be like a continuous circle.
Oh, sure. Okay. I suppose I have to. Everyone else did. So yeah, I mean, what I research and teach is such a hybrid subject, if you can call it that, mending. I mean, it's a obscured history. It's dispersed. It really doesn't exist in one place at all. And as for the business side, it is not. There isn't one. But it does pervade everything. I mean, once you look at it, it becomes clear where it exists, where it hasn't been looked at, if you follow that. So, I mean, this hybridization of all these subjects that is happening in the database that we've been talking about all day, I mean, this is absolutely where I live. And teaching it, as I've started to do with that course I mentioned at Parsons, that was undergrad. I'm going to teach a postgrad one in next spring. And it's to take students through a process of thinking through something that isn't a thing, that hasn't been a subject, and to look at ways into that, through fashion. Obviously, that's where it starts, because we're talking generally about. I do it with clothes. It's mending, not repair. Specifically, and especially female labor. It's about female invisible labor, and also unpaid. So I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but to get it to be something that is visceral to the students, we do it. We do mending, like scientists do science. Menders must do mending, otherwise you really can't understand it. So a lot of what's been said today has really resonated.
I have a question I want to follow up with that, and then I can pass it back to whomever. So menders do mending, but should somebody in fashion merchandising learn mending? And what would it teach them that's different from the mender who's learning mending to be a mender? Like, so in other words, what I'm saying is there value, is there pedagogical value? In other words, is it effective teaching? When you're teaching a class about mending to people who are interested in fashion design and mending, there's one sort of audience. But if you were to teach mending to people who are in the fashion industry, does it make something, I'm predicting, do you think it makes things more concrete? Is it more pedagogically sound, do you think? You might not have experience, but what is your feeling about that?
Okay. It's like she's come to my class.
Yes, yeah, I guessed in everyone's classes if anyone wants me. I'm always there. But no, so yes, I think what you assumed there is that I'm teaching fashion design students, but I'm not. No, but why would you know? Because I didn't explain that. No, these are electives, those, and they are. It's across the board. So I have many. I had at least probably half the class at Parsons the first year that they were in merchandising or in all those sort of hybrid. Integrated design, all those, yeah, a lot of integrated design. That's right. You know what I'm talking about. So I mean, that's exactly what. And you know, the doing of mending is actually the least. That's the least likely thing that we do because they're not there to teach, to learn to do it. Yeah. It's only we do it in order that they can understand thinking through it and with it. So it's flipped. So very much it does. It's supposed to. It's mending fashion is the name of that course because it's about conceptualizing the system, and how would that inserting mending into such a system change your system?
So Kate's talking about classes where she focuses the entire semester on mending, and I just am jumping in because I've had Kate come in for a single session inside another syllabus to teach my students mending, and I think it can be very useful in that way as well for my students because my students are more focused on the business side of fashion and taking classes that are more either business or humanities based in terms of assignments. Many of them, as Kate will recognize, do not know how to sew. Like they've never picked up, you know, that we're talking about students who, and this is not their focus, this is not their intention with taking fashion studies. But so even bringing this into my merchandising students, bringing this into my forecasting students, having us do this hands-on work, what I love about mending as opposed to trying to insert a more structured construction-based class that we would think of with traditional fashion design is that the barrier to entry on mending is level. You know, we're talking about not needing a fleet of sewing machines to do this class, not needing a bunch of dress forms to do this class, that we can have just a meeting and have needles and embroidery thread and they can bring in garments from their own wardrobe and we have rags and patches and they can do stuff with their hands and start to, through that, understand the value of their garments. In even just the labor that they're putting in for that 2-3 hour class or 1 hour session, and they see how long it takes them to do a running stitch across a patch, that there is value, I think, for them in whatever fashion class it is, because of course I'm focused on fashion, that it, in our 21st century world where we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about materials, we're talking about people wanting to value and keep and understand their clothing and material world, that mending is just this wonderful active learning way to really bring that into an experience and not just a sort of passive lecture. So everybody have Kate in their class.
Well, I guess the follow-up on that is we just got, me and my partner just got this research funding for AI generation of patterns and development of patterns and DIY patterns. So we're looking in the 50s and how patterns from big couture houses were given to people. Madame Gris would pass on hers for Balenciaga, would have this kind of passing of information via the patterns, and you can make them at home. But the big issue that we're running into now is the ability and the base ability. So I know how to sew because I have a BA in fashion design, but that base level skill is not really there. And so the value of clothes and the understanding of the making of value of clothes is kind of gone. So trying to reissue ways of making clothes at home has been a big kind of problem-solving issue that we're facing right now. Is, okay, to what skill level can people make, and to what skill level do people want to make, and is that a reality that we can push? My background is in outdoor wear and technical wear, so oftentimes I look at how farming communities in, say, India and where my family are from, don't have access to the nicest Arc'teryx jacket, don't have access to the clothes that they need. And how do we provide clothes that they can make themselves? So looking at zero-waste pattern cutting, which is what I specialize in, how we can provide clothes in different languages, in paper packs, so they can easily sew within their rural areas, so they can have access to the clothes that they actually need while farming. And these are conversations that we even having about New York City, about rising seawater levels and how a lot of our clothes are going to need to be a lot more waterproof in the next 30 years, because that is a pressing issue. So how do we have access or give access to people who need the access has been a big question. That's why maybe I will have you come to my class.
I will. Let's bring this. I'm going to bring it down here again just for a second. So I want to get back to the issue of like how do we bring this into the classroom? I mean, it's about pedagogy and research. And we have our own research, but so we have these big issues that we need to communicate to students. And we also have the reality that all of our students are going to go out into the workforce and that we all work. I work, you work, they're going to work, they are working currently. And bringing in sort of labor history as a humanities and interdisciplinary, and then also the making of things. I know I'm weaving a lot of things together. Maybe it sounds a little bit patchwork to some people here. But to bring this back to teaching, I'd just like to hear from some other people about like what tools do you use to teach in a way that sort of brings the issue of labor into the context of the topic that you're teaching, I guess. Even if it's not labor history, is there a way to bring labor in as a, I guess as a, not just as a topic, but as a, an activity, like the mending. Is there something besides mending? You talked about the walls. I mean about the doors rather. So from other people as well. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm going to pass this along. Anybody else?
Sure. Okay. Sorry. So last semester and this semester, I'm teaching history of African textiles and fashion, and one of the lessons that I teach is just 1 week on sustainability. And to do that, we look at a documentary called The Secret Life of Your Clothes, and it focuses on like what happens to your clothes when you donate them to like a charity shop, either in the United States or in the UK, and how it ends up in Ghana. And so I love how Sally put it earlier. Sustainability is not just about the environment, because as we were watching that particular documentary, this whole lesson was about sustainability in the environment. And then I realized as we were watching, like, oh, it's actually about jobs as well. The secondhand clothing market provides so many jobs for people in Ghana, not just in the big cities, but also just in the rural, smaller areas as well. And these jobs particularly are taken up by women who don't have access maybe to education or higher, or just better paying jobs. And so it feels like we have to weigh between saving the environment and doing away with these secondhand clothes and investing in local textile making practices, or do we just go with like the short-term solution and still rely on the influx of secondhand clothing so people can actually survive just on a day-to-day basis? And so I think that's still something that we wrestle with in our classes. But I think for me, that is a really good documentary to show, just to see that there are just so many issues at play.
Well, on a topic, speaking from my own experience, I just came back from a conference of art librarians, and I'm a librarian myself, and I'm an instructional services librarian. So a lot of what I do is I teach people about what's available at the library and how to use the databases, but also how to begin your research, how to grapple with a research question, this type of thing. And at this particular conference, there were a number of people who used the making of objects to teach information literacy, and who used that kind of work, like literally work in the classroom, to do some teaching. And one example that I thought was especially interesting, but beyond my reach, was there's a librarian at the University of Richmond who has it's like a bookmaking studio, like where you actually bind books. And she teaches all kinds of bookbinding. But there's a very small arts program and a very small book arts program, even smaller, at University of Richmond. She has students in from all different fields, including computer science, and they first express their research project in the form of a book. And they have to make a book, and they have to bind it, and they have to make it. And pedagogically, the way this works is, of course, learning how to make a book isn't going to necessarily help them in computer science. But it's in the making of the object that they have to organize their thoughts. And they have to slow down, and they have to be with an object. And it reminds me of what you did in your Egyptology class, and also the mending. And I do see that as a theme throughout all of this. So I just wanted to share that as an example. And I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about what is effective pedagogically, in terms of integrating actual labor, actual making into a classroom. So, but I think we've spoken to that some already. Are there any questions from the, hi, yes, it's time to turn our attentions out here.
So I know you guys have been talking about how to bring all sorts of stuff into the classroom that we're not doing yet, and I just want to throw one more curveball at you. I was having coffee with a couple of Parsons grad students earlier this week who in a class started a project that is now a extracurricular club to try to support passage of the Fashion Act, this state law that is being, I think, sponsored by Brad Lander and some other people. I was wondering if any of you are doing anything like that, anything about government and how government affects labor in these industries, and how we can lobby right now and make changes in the world.
Yes.
I've only done that to a small scale, and it's actually proposing workshops during my class that ask students what they think the groundwork of the issues are. Like, what do they start with thinking? Do they know this law that's going to be passed? Do they know that it's not like a countrywide thing? It's not a federal law. It's just a New York state law. Do they know that this could actually, where all the mills are in North Carolina, they're not going to have the same rights that they're going to have in this state? Like, are you going to solely produce in New York City? Like, there's a lot of these kind of workshops where we problem solve, because that's the only way that we can actually talk about it, because it feels very heavy when you hear these big laws being passed and then you don't really know what the fine details are. And we're talking to, in my case, fashion students, integrated design students, strategic design students, and their base level is, I want to make fashion better, but they also don't want to sit there reading the layman's of a very long study. So how do you break that down to them? It's like, oftentimes I speak about production. We just had, I think 2 weeks ago, a week on sustainability, and that's such a broad topic. We've already discussed like making and the systems and the people that function around it, and if you take one system away, it doesn't exist within a vacuum. So what happens when you stop using labor in maybe like a third world country? I hate using that term, but what would you do for those people? How are you supporting those systems? And it's quite interesting how you see a multitude of solutions, also a multitude of, I didn't realize this was an issue. And I think that's really the way. It's like really being open about the discussions of like, this is what's happening. There isn't a question that the climate change is happening. There's not a question that indigo dye is like ruining a lot of drinkable water across the planet. There isn't an issue saying that like synthetic indigo, there isn't a question to know that like in Ghana there's like piles and piles of clothes from British charity shops that never made it to someone else's house, and it's starting small and then trying to make it bigger. And kind of planting the seed is maybe what I would say is like, here's the initial seed. I'm only here with you for 8 weeks. And I think, where do you go from that? Like, where do you, as Parsons has a systems pathway, which works a lot more about the systems of fashion than actually the making of like clothes. And I think that is maybe something that classes should really include more, is like systems-based work instead of not just designing the clothes, but the whole system process. Like, where are you getting your fabric from? Are you using mordants in your natural dye? Are you using like all of these things? What, even your sewing thread down to the sewing thread, like, is it nylon based? Is it recycled nylon? There's all these things. And I think the due diligence is maybe what I've started to like push for my workshops, is like, you're saying you want sustainability, but yeah.
Did you have a follow-up? Okay. Well, no. You go first.
Wait, should I go? Or okay. I just wanted to say, so it's, teaching ancient cultures and civilizations. The question might be, well, what does this have to do with us today? And, of course, there are a lot of things that are very foreign about ancient Egypt compared to how we live today. But I think that's an interesting point where we can think about where we are and where we've come from. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that we see in ancient cultures that continue. And one of the things that I do in my class is to try to or I encourage my students to find these parallels. So a major theme in my class is how kings, specifically people in power, specifically exploit laborers. And while that may sometimes look a little bit different than how we see it today, when you abstract this concept enough, you can start to see patterns. And so that becomes a really interesting point of discussion in our classes as well.
So kind of building on that, I just wanted to say that I think that history is a tool for empowerment. And I think that's sort of what today has been so much about, and is that fashion can be such a forward-looking industry. And as we've already talked about, fashion can be such a bad actor globally, that are based in systems that seem infallible, that seem like they've always existed, that then we teach in our classrooms because we're trying to prepare our students to go into a labor force and know how to do and operate in these systems. But it's, for me, even if I'm not teaching a class that's about history, that doesn't have history in the title, I always include historical perspectives, and I'm sure sort of everyone here does, because history is a tool for dismantling misconceptions. History is a tool for understanding that the way things operate in the systems that exist right now, understanding that they're fallible, and giving tools through that knowledge to empower students to continue to question everything that they encounter and to try to encourage them to dismantle these systems through their work. And I really don't think that we could do that without history effectively. And so these projects that give us access to different modes of history and bringing that into any classroom, I think is really wonderful.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly build on that. I mean, I'm a Gothamist. I'm a political and cultural historian of New York City. And when I teach the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, it's not only how reforms came out of that tragedy and eventually crystallized themselves nationally in the New Deal under Francis Perkins as Secretary of Labor under President Roosevelt, but helping students understand that out of tragedy there is potential for change, right? And I think history as an academic discipline, more than maybe most other academic disciplines, it's something that can be understood by those who aren't experts in the field and thus has a potential to influence policy in a very real way that other fields might not. And so I think that, look, I'm not out to influence policy necessarily in the present, but to learn from the past and think about how we can help that inform us in influencing policy in the future.
Are you? What was that look? You're funny.
Something you wanted.
Oh no, I just I've noticed that there's a lot of students in the audience, and I was wondering if anybody had any questions or had anything to say specifically about your experience with what works in terms of teaching style and the pleasure or the pain that that comes out of projects that sort of include an interdisciplinary aspect or ask, I think I've said enough. Anybody in the audience who is currently a student who might want to speak to that? Okay, yep. And now I'm all wrapped around here. There we go. I really am. Okay, there we go. Okay. I get to be Ricky Lake or whomever. Here we go. Okay. I saw a bunch of hands go up. And then you and no.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, and I'm a fashion design major, and I think a lot of people can relate to me because we're an art school, that I'm a visual learner, and I enjoy just touching things. Like, I'm really interested in that mending class, actually, but, yeah, like, me personally, like, especially with history, like, I fall asleep a lot in history class, but when it's, like, something that I can interact with, talk about, or just even, like, watch, like, it's a lot more interesting to me than just, like, being in a lecture in the dark, watching, like, just pictures on the slide. But history is really interesting to me. It's just, like, I can't help but to fall asleep sometimes.
So let's see if I can get this to really extend. Oh, thank you.
My name is Felix. I'm an illustration major. I kind of want to just talk about this from the perspective. I'm in Dan Levinson's class, and I went to the convention in Philly and was able to experience that. And I think just having that opportunity to go to that convention and go to like a different city, just kind of see the environment and the type of people that are there and want to learn about what like historians have to say, like was really insightful and kind of like has made me more open to stuff like all of that. Like I don't think I would be talking right now if I didn't do that. Like that was such a big like leap for me to take because I'm like a very like kind of shy person. So to go and do that was really something big for me to do. And now, I mean, I'm like freaking out right now, but I can do this. But I feel comfortable enough to do this and talk about this. So I think it's really important to kind of have those opportunities and have the option to do events and stuff like that. Like I think it really changes your perspective as a student, because it's also a big thing as a student. You don't get seen as like a person of not like authority, but like I mean it's more of a high school thing, but like with respect.
Right.
So like I got to speak to these people as kind of like
you're the person making the
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like people were looking to me to explain what something was and give my perspective, and I had such like an open opportunity to do that, and I felt like that was just really important.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to reflect on effective teaching and what's yes, please, we're a student. Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Okay. And then you're next.
Hi, my name is Constance. I'm a graphic design major, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to express gratitude because I'm a little older, and I came back to school after working in the industry, and a lot of people will ask, like, why'd you go back to school? Or, like, what are you getting out of it? What's the point, you know? and I really think it's the history is really what makes me complete now. Like knowing what came before what I'm doing, and knowing the history. And I surprisingly have an art history major, and I wasn't expecting that. So I love it, and it's really great. And I love the class that I have now. It's art in New York, and we get to go see the art in New York. You know, it's like I pay so much rent, so you know it's so nice to like explore the place I live instead of sitting behind a computer. So I don't know. Thank you guys.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's a little tangled right now. But okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Peshi. I'm also a fashion design student. I'm in children's wear. And I had a bit of a question. I know a lot of you teach like in fashion or teach in fields that are related to it. So, and you had also talked about kind of like the exploitation of like workers by like higher ups. I was curious how you approach sort of the discussion around internships with students as well. And I know a lot of students who have sort of had negative experiences with specific internships and being taken advantage of, and what you're supposed to say no to and what you say yes to. So I was just curious. I figured so many people from so many different like teaching fields, what are your different approaches for sort of like tackling that discussion with your students?
I do. I do. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
So in France or French context, as you can imagine, when students talk about internships, many of them want to become involved with some of the large and well-known fashion houses. And one of the problems with that is when we engage with them, it's all about positivity and how wonderful everything is, and very few of those folks want to engage with the underbelly, so to speak, of the industry. And so I talk to students, and we talk about it in my culture classes. There is a negative in terms of how some of these garments are produced. When we move beyond the large fashion houses, when things like a Dior sweater or a Chanel dress, which largely, as most of you know better than I do, are created by hand and sewn by hand and beaded by hand. When you move beyond kind of the upper shelf, so to speak, a lot of these garments are produced in very problematic circumstances and scenarios. And I think what I wanted to add is one of the commonalities or common threads that I see here is this idea of hands-on experience and going out into the field and taking students during a study abroad to this workshop where garments are created by immigrants, and not just trying to mimic that process alongside of them, but to speak to them and talk about their everyday lived experience. That, for me, is such a strong takeaway, that students understand that it's not all about getting an internship at Chanel, for example. It's understanding, where do some of these street clothes come from? How are they made? Who are they made by? And they really come away from those conversations with a much deeper understanding of not just how to mend or how to sew or how to produce an item of clothing, but what are the cultural, historical, fill in the blank impacts of all of that. And they have such a rich understanding after of, so many deeper questions that I think really inform their overall understanding of the whole industry.
I'm going to try to talk about this without getting too passionate. So a lot of the times when my students come to me to talk about labor opportunities, like working maybe down the line at a museum or a gallery, where I understand a lot of the times you have these unpaid internships. And now I've been very lucky and fortunate that I've never had to have an unpaid internship myself. Because I had, various opportunities presented to me for that. So I always tell my students, don't take an unpaid internship. However, I also understand that Maybe sometimes it feels like it's necessary as well, at which point I advise students to always think about what is your compass, like what is your threshold? Because also this exploitation is not just with unpaid labor, it's with paid labor too. It happens here at this school. I'm just gonna say, as with adjuncts, thank you. Because, you know, I was an adjunct for like 7 years before I got this full-time position, which is still not a permanent position for me. So my position is very tenuous at Pratt. It's one of the reasons why I stay working here. But I have, like, in my mind and in my heart, like, what is sort of my boundaries? And I think that's very important for students to understand the extent and to make a promise to yourself that you won't degrade yourself, to always come up with other options. Because I always have a plan B. And the rule for me, because I'm in academia, is that I don't need academia, but academia might need me. So that's how I think you should reframe things.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Jennifer. For me, when I think about my students and when I think about these moments of internships, for me, I want to expose students to the fact that the fashion industry can sometimes be, quite frankly, really horrible. I think that a lot of people, sadly, have had horrible experiences and been treated horribly within the fashion industry. And I think that that's as consumers, as laborers in all different facets. I love fashion, and I also have a lot of issues with fashion, which is why I teach about fashion. And so whenever I have guest speakers, and I always try to bring guest speakers, again, into every one of my classes, people who work in the industry in different facets, because I want my students to hear from them. And they always have these moments when I'm on the phone with them before they're coming, and they're like asking what they should cover. They're like, "Oh, I won't touch on that. I don't want to freak out your students or make." And I'm always like, "No, tell them the challenges you face. Tell them the bad parts. Like, tell them about those bad experiences, because fashion is also an industry that loves to produce a luster, right? Like, that's so much a part of the fashion production system is the luster, and it obscures the realities and some of these really toxic environments." And to your point, Jennifer, I do think it's about also making sure students feel emotionally supported as well while they're doing these. So for me, with my students, I'm fortunate enough to teach at a place where my classes are 20, 25 students. I get to know my students really well. And I always tell them, you know, my door is always open. If you're having a bad experience, if you're, you know, just know that I'm someone, like, yes, there's career services, and yes, there's maybe whoever your advisor is, but you can always come to me. And I do think that that's just really important for me personally as an educator, to just get to know my students and know and create a space where they feel like I'm someone that they can come to talk about the reality of stuff if they need. But it's a really big challenge. Internships are a really murky space in fashion.
I speak from experience. I've worked and do work as a designer. I did my first stage in Paris, so it was tough. I think the reality is that it's never going to be perfect, and you have to kind of go in knowing what you want from it. Like, I didn't go into my first stage in Paris being like, I'm going to be able to design things. That's not the realities of it. Like, the realities are you're going to be sewing buttons, and you're going to be sewing more buttons, and maybe some lace, you know, like, and it's hard because I know where I am in this industry. I was also very lucky that I only had to take one unpaid internship, and that in the UK they put it part of your education, so you get your student loan to cover the costs if it is unpaid. So it balances itself out. Here it's very difficult comparatively. And also there's a catch-22 because you might want to work for the cooler brand who is doing the sustainable things, but they definitely don't have the infrastructure most of the time to be able to pay you in the same way that the brand like Michael Kors could, because they do have the infrastructure to pay you. I think when going to pick an internship or applying to internships, think what you want to get out of it. A smaller brand, you'll get a lot more hands-on experience. With a larger brand, you'll be part of the cog, but also being part of the cog, as I've learned from a lot of my industry peers, is a lot more comfortable than being like, am I going to get paid next week? So you always have to find the balance and set your boundaries up front. Like, that is my or like I write it down, like when you have your interview, tell them this is how many days you can work. Tell them this is what you can do. Because if you say you can do everything, then they will expect everything, and then the weight of the world will essentially be on your shoulders, because you'll be trying to argue with your boss, or the guy who's getting also exploited by his boss, who's also getting exploited by his boss, who's then also getting exploited by the CEO while he's on a trip in Saint-Tropez. So it's just so you got to find the balance. It's not easy. I've done, I think, 4 before I started getting actual paid like associate designer jobs, and yeah, it's a minefield to navigate. Just, I think, keep your head up. If it looks fishy, probably is fishy. That's like, if it doesn't look right, it doesn't feel right, don't do it. And be nice to yourself. If you can't do it, it's not the end of the world. Like, there's always going to be times in your life where you have to say no to things. So.
Yeah, Pesci, great question. And one other thing that I try to tell my students when it comes up is think about when you're the person who's giving out internships many years from now. Just because you got hazed doesn't mean you have to haze someone else. And in fact, if you look at the last 200 years of capitalism or the last 2,000 years of economic behavior, one of the things that we see is a correlation between treating people better in the workplace and increased productivity and wealth. And that's a lesson that the fashion industry does not seem to have learned. It thinks that if you treat people badly, you will create a better, more profitable product. And that's just pretty clearly wrong. So hopefully if we have these conversations over and over again, I don't know that you guys are going to get treated better, but you might treat other people better in the future.
And it's back to me, and I have nothing to say, which is really remarkable. Are there any other questions from the audience, or is there any last parting words from? Maybe I can send this around, and everybody can. We're good. Send it around. Send it around. Well, I want to thank. Okay, you want? Okay.
So, Helen, thank you so much for moderating this most difficult panel 4. And some of my students from RT New York came. They are seated in the back. And we had a whole session from 9:45 in the morning all the way until now. And if you go to the website, you can see the whole program of it. But this is student empowerment. This is for the student empowerment. And the last question was very appropriate about the internship. And, the way we then I originally created teaching business history is all about this kind of conversation, students being taken advantage of, or they need a safe space to talk about the realities of their jobs, like how they talk to their boss, or how boss treat themselves, or how they treat younger interns. And in many times, especially in photography department, I know students go like 2 full days to work in somebody's studio, and then they say they don't have enough time to come back and finish my assignment. And that's how all the conversation started. I go, how come you have so much work to do so that you are not finishing your schoolwork? Is it the realities of your internship? Anyhow, as Professor Vincent said, we are going to make a better world based on our education, and we treat our workers a little bit better terms, and that's probably takeaways from this long project. But thank you so much for coming, everybody. And the microphone does not do anything. I just hold on to it so that it's being recorded. So I hope you can mingle and ask more questions to our speakers from other places, like not FIT, other places. So thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy your weekend.